Now it's time to take a look at what I consider the most important aspect of Elden Ring and what I would consider the baseline for the next several sections of this critique to build upon, that being none other than the gameplay. There are many elements which comprise the Elden Ring gameplay experience, but the first of these I'd like to cover is that which is most distinct from prior From entries, that being none other than Torrent. It seems like every totally not Souls game that From has put out has had a particular mechanical focus. For Bloodborne it was systems that encouraged aggressive play, such as guns and the rally meter. For Sekiro it was deflecting, and similar parry techniques such as the spear stomp, which existed not only to encourage defensive play, but also work in tandem with the new posture system. For Elden Ring they opted for a mechanic that would help to blend the core Souls mechanics with an open world format. Torrent makes a lot of sense on paper to include, however, to put it rather bluntly, I think they bumbled the execution. It's not awful, but there are some glaring oversights involving it that make me question just how much attention this mechanic was given during development. In Bloodborne and Sekiro, they went out of their way to account for the new mechanics and playstyles. I'm critical of Sekiro in many regards, but one thing I can't accuse it of is getting lazy. If anything, I think they tried a bit too hard with it. For Torrent in particular, it almost feels like they gave us an adequate amount of what was necessary and called it a day, which is rather ironic since my typical criticism of Elden Ring has to do with the game not knowing when to say enough is enough. Torrent works and plays mostly fine, but like I said, there are some baffling oversights regarding Torrent that feel not only rather apparent, but I doubt they would have been that hard to patch up in the first place. I know it might seem a little mean-spirited to bash the game for not doing so much with a given mechanic, but given Torrent's presence as one of the core elements specifically to Elden Ring, I think it's more than fair to put the magnifying glass to it. However, there are aspects of Torrent that I appreciate, so I want to start by highlighting those. The first and perhaps most important aspect of Torrent that I find to be pretty well done is just how well it controls. It's just as responsive as the player character, and although the lack of a startup to its jump animation does make it feel a bit springy, I love the fact that Torrent can double jump. It gives Torrent more to work with beyond just moving faster than the player character, because now Torrent plays a significant role in navigating more complex terrain and even platforming. That's worth commending because for a lot of games, horseback mechanics can often feel like they're only there to marginally speed things up. I think Assassin's Creed 3 is probably the worst example I can think of when it comes to this. You can also engage in combat while on Torrent, and it's not great. In fairness to Elden Ring, horseback combat is not an easy thing to nail for any game. If I'm being honest, I think the only game I've ever truly enjoyed horseback combat in was probably Zelda Twilight Princess, but you also have to bear in mind that I haven't played that game since it came out on the GameCube, so take that with a grain of salt. Otherwise, my perception of horseback combat in games is mostly negative. Red Dead Redemption 2 was pretty good, but even it was far from perfect. Elden Ring almost nails it. My biggest point of praise would easily be the fact that projectiles aren't hindered in any way by awkward movement, coupling really well with how Torrent controls, and not to mention the lock-on system. And this really goes for all projectile-focused builds, be it archers, sorcerers, clerics, and so on. The issue with Torrent combatively, though, is twofold. Attacking with melee while moving at such fast speeds makes landing your attacks extremely cumbersome at times. This isn't too much of a problem on its own, and it even makes sense why that would be the case, but it becomes far worse when coupled with Torrent's lack of dedicated defensive capabilities. Torrent goes pretty fast, but it's also not Malenia or Malekith. It can't cross enormous distances that guarantee safety in between equally fast and accurate attacks that allow it the breathing room necessary to justify a complete lack of a block or dodge. Some enemies even attack so fast and have such accurate tracking that Torrent is completely incapable of dodging them, making it an active danger to even use within the already limited capacity that Torrent finds itself in combatively. Again, this on its own wouldn't be that much of an issue were it not for the fact that trying to attack while riding Torrent can also feel quite cumbersome. Torrent having a weakness or two in relation to the combat was to be expected. After all, it makes sense in trying to balance out the mechanic. But these two issues in conjunction with one another feel like a rather steep handicap to put against the player, and it leaves Torrent in an awkward position of really only being applicable to pretty specific combat scenarios where both issues don't happen to be prevalent. which feels more like an unintentional consequence of design rather than the true intent of the design. The second issue with Torrent is one that I take with the double jump. Unfortunately, for some unfathomable reason, the double jump doesn't negate fall damage. Not only does this flat out not even make sense, physically speaking, but it acts as a very artificial method of limiting exploration. You thought you were being clever by intuiting a unique solution to your traversal dilemma with outside-the-box thinking? Well, guess what? You're wrong. Now prepare to be punished for it. This kind of thing really gets on my nerves because the game doesn't benefit in any way from applying this kind of limitation, especially given the already inconsistent feel of Elden Ring's fall damage. Could you imagine how much more interesting speedruns especially would be with something like this to take advantage of? It's honestly the perfect encapsulation of the core issue with Elden Ring. It prioritizes punishing you at all costs, even when it feels completely unwarranted or unnecessary, versus rewarding you for using your head. That is, however, a bold claim given the scope of the game, so for now, I'll leave that point to linger as we dissect the game further. Elden Ring does have another mechanic to introduce though, that being the guard counter. I'm extremely mixed on this mechanic. On one hand, it deals increased damage to enemy stance and can be a great way to execute an immediate follow-up to an enemy attack that will almost assuredly connect. On the other, enemies are so unrelenting and hard-hitting that shields feel rather disincentivized as a whole, let alone using an attack which would require you to use so much of your stamina. At that point, you'd be better off just using the jumping attack, because like the guard counter, the jumping attack deals bonus stagger damage. However, unlike the guard counter, they cost even less stamina and take notably less time to execute, and can even lead to you dodging enemy attacks, thus sparing your stamina further. It also doesn't help that Elden Ring, unlike Sekiro, doesn't actually show you the boss's stance meter, meaning that you won't really have any idea how well you're wearing them down until it finally happens. Not only does this make it difficult to calculate for moves as demanding as the guard counter, but this also makes it difficult to anticipate when you'll even be able to go in for the follow-up. Stance breaks open up enemies for critical hits, but the windows for punish that they provide can be extremely slim depending on the enemy. So sometimes you won't even get to reap the reward because you had no idea that the reward was even about to come. Moments like this are extremely frustrating, because it feels like you bided your time for a payoff that was ultimately stolen right out from under you, and that sort of dissatisfaction is antithetical when it comes to games like this, which pride themselves on providing the player with a challenge that's supposed to be satisfying to overcome and rewarding to gain a grasp and understanding of. Elden Ring also suffers from major technical and balancing issues, and they're honestly staggering as you start adding them up. The first and perhaps most frustrating of the issues regarding Elden Ring's gameplay are the hitboxes. Now, From games have always been rather hit or miss, pun intended, when it comes to hitboxes. On one hand, you have games like Dark Souls 2, where hitboxes on average are so atrocious that it's become a meme just how laughably bad they are. On the other hand, games like Dark Souls 3 on average are impressively airtight with their hitboxes, though even the best of these games do have their exceptions. Elden Ring reminds me of Sekiro in that the quality of the hitboxes is extremely mixed. I've had moments where I was genuinely blown away by just how tight certain hitboxes appeared to be, but I've also had just as many moments where I found myself astonished at just how bad certain hitboxes were. Though when it comes to Elden Ring, I have noticed certain levels of consistency between different attack types, at least for the most part. Sword attacks are by far the most accurate, having hitboxes that are extremely tight, which allows for a great many possibilities when looking to outmaneuver one's opponent. Slashes, stabs, sweeps, etc. are on the whole pretty good. I recall being impressed as early as the tutorial area when an enemy lunged at me from a slightly elevated position, and his sword poked just over my shoulder and only slightly off from my head. This was extremely impressive, and I can recall similar scenarios occurring at multiple points throughout my time with Elden Ring. And it's not just a thumbs up to the game's technical prowess. Airtight hitboxes allow for a surprising degree of creativity when it comes to dodging enemy attacks when they prove consistent enough. By coming to understand precisely the positioning you'll need to avoid taking damage, you then begin to intuit how best to seamlessly counter your foes. It's extremely satisfying to bob and weave within such tight windows after amassing such a thorough knowledge of the game, and it allows less experienced players to experience their own moments of similar satisfaction when they just manage to outmaneuver their foes. And hey, sometimes you just get really lucky, and that can feel great too. Unfortunately, where Elden Ring craps the proverbial bed is when it comes to slam attacks, command grabs, and AoEs, among which include some of the most downright horrendous and atrociously coded hitboxes I think I've ever seen in my 2.5 decades of gaming, at least with FromSoft games. Slam attacks in Elden Ring honestly cause my blood pressure to skyrocket the moment I see them coming, because whenever I do, I feel like the game is throwing out a malicious dice roll to decide whether or not I'll be insta-killed by the sinister particle effects of doom. Combine how unfair it can feel to suddenly drop dead thanks to a lingering hitbox from some dirt that was hurled into the air with just how likely it is for you to wind up unknowingly in the range of this deadly dust thanks to the ridiculous tracking of enemies, and this is easily the most frustrating and unfair punish method in the game. Well, one of them, anyways. Then there's command grabs, and my God, some of these are downright terrible. It's not enough that so many enemies, especially bosses, are now equipped with command grabs, but when the hitboxes are bad, it can really bring down a fight, no matter how good that fight otherwise is. Elden Ring is full of badly coded command grabs, to the point that it honestly became a personal fear of mine whenever I would encounter a new boss. There are 3 in particular that I'd like to highlight, those being the command grabs of Morgott, Estelle, and, you guessed it, Malenia, Blade of Mikola. Morgott's command grab seems to possess a lingering hitbox where you can find yourself impaled by his sword even if you touch the base of it while he is thrusting forward. Estelle seems to linger and even trail up to his elbow, and Malenia seems to outstretch her actual arm's length while also having a really fast windup that's difficult to read because it looks very similar to some of her other attacks, so yeah. These are pretty frustrating to deal with, and that is putting it mildly. Command grabs are supposed to be among the highest damage dealing attacks in an enemy's arsenal, and as such, it should be one of their easiest attacks to avoid. But there are times where these things feel like they're the most likely moves in the boss's arsenal to connect. Particularly Estelle, whose command grab is honestly downright horse crap, and to put it simply, it's not fair. Then there's the AoEs, and similarly to the dust particles of doom that often accompany slamming attacks, these more often than not were a source of major frustration to say the least. These things are already quite massive compared to the AoEs of previous games, like you really have to back the fuck off the moment you see Malenia going for her dive bomb, Morgott getting ready to cut that centuries-old cheese, or Radagon going into his pseudo phase 2, it's a phase 2, where literally all of his attacks just have an obnoxious AoE stapled onto them, including his command grab, which can hit you even when he has grabbed another player. So yeah, it can be pretty annoying when you do get tagged by some invisible extension of an attack that you already worked so hard to dodge, or when an attack just has no business hitting you in the first place. The whole point of these is to repel the player and test their positioning, so it just feels excessive and pointless when the enemy manages to blow you back further than you already were after having sprinted in the opposite direction of the enemy. AoEs also tend to have lingering hitboxes, and it just looks and feels silly getting blown back from the remains of a blast. This also ties into another problem I've had with Elden Ring that I've mentioned a couple of times now. I alluded to it back in the intro, but Elden Ring also has a severe issue when it comes to enemy tracking. Enemy tracking has been an issue in From games going back as far as Dark Souls 2, and honestly even a couple of times in Dark Souls 1. And it seems as though Elden Ring is content not only to allow this to persist, but it almost feels like the game is actively doubling down on enemy tracking as if it's an actual featured mechanic given just how aggressive it can be, especially when it comes to bosses. Let me make this abundantly clear. In a combat system like this, enemies that are this large and this fast have no business being able to track you beyond what should be the given path of their attacks. It looks utterly ridiculous, and it only serves to infuriate the player. Please, please, FromSoft, stop making your enemies move this way. It is distractingly obnoxious. I don't really mind it when smaller enemies have a bit of tracking, hell the player character even tracks to an extent when locked on, but this kind of thing is far less noticeable with smaller character models that aren't flying around the arena. It's the kind of thing that's subtle enough to where your mind just registers it as being simple enough to explain as a basic adjustment of footing, or even the enemy dragging themselves with the weight of their attack, and yeah, that's fair. But once you start getting to models the size of Malenia, or God forbid Radahn and Rykard, this kind of thing becomes far more noticeable, and sometimes it's just downright comical. Not only does it just look absurd, but it gets really frustrating when you feel like you've dodged an attack only for Berserko Seed number 5000 to completely nullify your efforts by recalibrating its center of gravity on a dime. I'm honestly not even exaggerating. You can visibly make out how these character models are turning on the x-axis, and it's impossible not to see it after having noticed it. The worst is by far Malenia's Waterfowl Dance, an infamous attack that's come to be known by the community. So yeah, combine the sheer degree at which enemies will track the player with the frustratingly high number of wonky hitboxes, and Elden Ring can feel more than a little unfair at times, and not in a way that's intentional with its design. This kind of thing isn't even difficulty. It's frustrating bullshit, and that feeling of unearned punishment is the last thing you want to feel when playing games like this. Then there's projectiles, and oh dear lord, they are as bad as ever. Projectiles have been a strange issue since as long ago as the first Dark Souls, where for some reason FromSoft thought it made sense to incorporate minor tracking to enemy projectiles. For magic, yeah, okay, I kinda get it to an extent. After all, it's magic. It doesn't not make sense for it to have a bit of tracking, if that makes sense. But the fact that arrows and bolts also manage to track you to the extent that they do, it just looks really stupid. And we all know it. Like, what is there to gain from making arrows magically drift exactly where the player happens to be going? Especially the Dragon Slayer arrows in Anor Londo. Like, oh my god, I love Anor Londo, but fuck that.
Well, Loveless, if they didn't track, then it would be really easy to dodge them.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know, maybe make the projectiles just a little bit faster so that it's harder to dodge them. Or maybe, oh, I don't know, throw in an environmental hazard? Just a thought. Elden Ring also introduces enemy catapults and, yep, you guessed it, somehow these things will hone in on your position despite being fired in a completely different direction more often than not. Even from a distance, it's so blatantly obvious that it honestly just feels like the game is trying to have a laugh at your expense, though it doesn't really succeed most of the time. That's the funniest part. They're not even that hard to dodge, so the visual integrity of these things were completely compromised in favor of a payoff that doesn't even occur. Again, it feels like Elden Ring is prioritizing the player being punished at the expense of all other qualities of life, and it gets really distracting after a while. Then there's the camera, and oh boy is it bad. Seriously, this is a fundamentally critical element of these games, and yet it has been a persistent issue since even the original Demon Souls. Why is it that no one thought it prudent to improve the camera, the very thing that the player literally needs in order to gain an understanding of what is even happening in the video game that they're playing? Why has this never once seen any improvement, especially nowadays where enemies are moving faster than coked up kangaroos? I don't understand. The Souls camera is at its all-time worst when it comes to Elden Ring given the sheer scale of its bosses and their utterly blistering speed. The fact that the camera has been given zero contingencies to account for the size and speeds of these enemies is honestly baffling to me. It is actually impossible to beat this game without experiencing a handful of moments where the camera goes completely haywire just from trying to keep up with the pace of these enemies. I understand that the manual camera speed needs to have a limit to its speed, but there is zero excuse for the camera to just automatically deactivate when locked on, especially when an enemy begins to cover so much area in such a small window of time. Given how many attacks involve these kinds of animations, it can lead to a lot of frustratingly unearned punishment for the player. Why on earth can the player be punished for the camera's failures? That doesn't make sense, and it is ridiculous.
Well, Loveless, if the camera was able to move that fast, then things would start to look ridiculous when trying to keep up with enemies as fast as Malenia.
That is correct. Very astute observation. So maybe, oh I don't know, recalibrate the enemy's movement and speed so that such a scenario doesn't happen. Not only does the camera's inability to keep up with Elden Ring's fastest enemies show a fatal weakness in this very core and essential mechanic, but it also paints a transparent picture of just how far the difficulty of this game outpaced its own design. These games were not made with enemies like this in mind. This is not Devil May Cry. This is not Bayonetta. Hell, this isn't even Lollipop Chainsaw, okay? So if you want to incorporate enemies like these, the game needs to be recalibrated in order to compensate for this design choice. Then there's the fact that the camera has no idea what to do against the likes of the Fire Giant, Rykard, or the Elden Beast, at least from up close. This is especially strange to me given we had a solution for giant bosses as far back as Demon Souls. Guys, just pull the camera back. Like, this isn't even complicated. Just pull the camera back, make sure it doesn't clip through the environment, and if it does, then just increase the transparency of the objects that the camera is cutting through so as not to block the camera's view. Surely I am not being unreasonable when I say this. These games have had this solution as far back as Demon Souls for over a decade. I don't understand why this was just omitted from Elden Ring. I mean, Zelda was doing this back on the Nintendo 64 for God's sake. There's also the fact that sometimes, even though you're locked on, the player character will attack in a different direction than the enemy. This was most common with jump attacks, and it just looks really stupid. What? Did the game seriously think that I was trying to attack to the left of Godfrey? That's technically his right. You get the idea. One element of Elden Ring's gameplay that doesn't get talked about very much, though, is the stealth. Elden Ring's stealth is, and please try not to get mad when I say this, more or less on par with The Last of Us 2's in terms of just how shallow it is, though in fairness to The Last of Us 2, at least its encounters were designed with stealth as an option, you know, for the most part. Stealth in Elden Ring certainly exists, but it's so shallow that it honestly might as well not even exist. I mean, come on. There's no stat that contributes to stealth, meaning that there's no way to dedicate a build entirely around stealth. It's impossible to use against bosses, period, and most enemy layouts make using stealth a completely impractical approach. Yeah, there are occasional encounters where stealth is actually a viable thing, but it doesn't really go any further than you can crouch and try and hide behind things as you approach your destination. Like, it's really, really simple. With that said, some of you are probably wondering, why even bring this up if it's such a non-option? And the reason is simple. FromSoft put it in the game. They even implemented a crouch so that the player could use it. That is why the crouch exists. This is, for all intents and purposes, one of Elden Ring's primary mechanics, but it's so flat and lacking that most people forget that it even exists. Like, I'm sure there are at least a few of you watching this that thought to yourself, wait, what? When I started talking about Elden Ring having stealth. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say, I don't think that's a good thing. If they weren't gonna do anything with it, then why implement it at all? Why dedicate an input to this crouch? What even was the point here? The sheer lack of depth in this game's stealth is genuinely fascinating to me. Like, I genuinely cannot remember the last time that I saw a mechanic so lackadaisically implemented into a game, let alone a AAA game like this. This is especially strange given From's last game prior to Elden Ring, not counting the Demon Souls remake, being Sekiro, which had dedicated stealth mechanics which ensured its viability for a significant portion of the game. Don't get me wrong, it's far from perfect, but you can tell that they were putting in a serious effort. Elden Ring has nothing to mechanically complement its stealth. There's no stealth bonus, no jumping stealth takedowns, no special animations, no dedicated builds, no shimmying to take advantage of, and it doesn't even mesh with Elden Ring's focus on aggressive play. It just makes backstabbing marginally easier in a handful of isolated scenarios. I'm being completely genuine when I say this is one of the worst implementations of any kind of mechanic I've ever seen in a video game, or at the very least, it's one of the most half-assed. I hesitate to call it lazy because it might be one of those victims of time constraints or lack of resources, but at that point I would just ask, why even implement it in the first place? Why not just divert that time and effort into improving something else? Sure, in Dark Souls you could sneak quote-unquote, by slowly walking up to an enemy from behind for a backstab, but it's also not as if Dark Souls was deluding the player into thinking that stealth was a genuine option like in other RPGs. Demon Souls did use stealth as a gimmick for 2 of its boss fights, but that was about the extent of it, because the devs were fully aware at the time that proper stealth gameplay with their mechanics just wasn't possible. Well, it was possible in Elden Ring, and they clearly wanted to implement it in some capacity, but they put all of zero effort into doing so, and that deserves to be criticized. One issue that's been present in From games for quite some time, however, is that of quest design. I've already talked about Elden Ring's main quest and the strange prerequisites for completing the first chunk of it, but the game's side quests are no exception either. For reasons that are at this point well beyond my capacity to understand, FromSoft quests tend to be designed in a way that only allows for their completion via happenstance, or just giving up and looking up a guide. Demon Souls was mostly alright. The only real side quests in that game were the ones with Yurt and Mephistopheles, but those were pretty straightforward. If you save Yurt, you find him in the Nexus, then kill some people at his request. Upon reaching pure black character tendency, Mephistopheles appears, and similarly to Yurt, you do what she tells you. The end of their quest lines are clearly marked by both of them trying to inevitably betray you, at which point you have no other option than to kill them, and that's where the quests end. Then Dark Souls happened, and this is where From fell into the habit of creating side quests which lack any sort of cohesive through line. It's not that the sequence of events themselves don't necessarily make sense, they're just borderline impossible to intuit without a guide, barring certain very specific instances like Big Hat Logan telling you outright that he is going to the Duke's archives. Quests like Siegmeyer's, however, are very guilty of this, and it's a shame because the conclusion of his quest line is genuinely brilliant. They did patch in quest markers for certain side quests, but even though these are helpful, they also go against the notion of the game giving the player no direction, so I'm not entirely sure whether or not I can consider them a good thing. Even though, yes, I did criticize the game's lack of direction, so make of that what you will. Objectively speaking, it is betraying its own design philosophy, but it is also an objective benefit to the game, so it's really hard for me to judge. The only issue I take with it personally is the fact that they didn't give any sort of additional guidance to the main quest, since that's the one that, actually matters. Honestly, From's quest design just needs a major overhaul at this point. And speaking from a narrative perspective, why is it that these characters are so vague and unclear with their directions, assuming they give you any at all? All of them do a great job at introducing you to their quest line, either establishing their goals and motivations, or tossing you that necessary breadcrumb to begin your investigation. Assuming, of course, that they're not trying to subvert you like Yura, kind of, or Patches. But when it comes to actually telling you what you need to do, these characters are about as transparent as the fog in Silent Hill. Is it really too much to ask that a character just say, hey, I think this thing might be over here? At least then you would have something to go off of besides sheer happenstance. This is a gigantic open world, and the idea that we're supposed to complete quests by happening across the necessary NPCs, let alone after having completed some unexplained goal in such a specific order, is honestly mind-boggling. There were a handful of quest markers added to the game post-launch for a handful of side quests, and also that part of the main story immediately following Morgott, so that's, nice, I think. I mean, it's a bit more direction, sure, but it also feels pretty half-baked, to put it as kindly as possible. At least the side quest markers make sense. The Volcano Manor questline, for instance, has you hunting down some fellow Tarnished, and the targets are marked on your map. It's a pretty straightforward hit job, pretty much. Going back briefly to the main story, though, can I just point out how strange it is that Melina is so needlessly obtuse about what it is that we're supposed to even be doing? She first appears to ask you to go on a quest to become Elden Lord, which you were already doing, kind of. However, she never bothers to explain what it is that you're even supposed to do to achieve this. You don't even get to ask her for so much as a hint. Like, this can't just be me. She's willing to commit immolation. She will burn herself alive just to achieve her goal of putting an end to the current tisms in the lands between, but she can't be bothered to give us basic instruction like, hey, go kill some demigods where you can enter Lindel, where you'll finally be able to reach the base of the Air Tree and claim the throne of the Elden Lord. By the way, the Graces point you where you need to go. That is literally all she needed to say. Was that really too much to ask? And in fairness to FromSoft, when it comes to their main quests, every other one of their games did it. Demon Souls told you to slay the archdemons. Dark Souls told you to ring the bells, then gather the Lord Souls. Dark Souls 2 told you bear seek lest. Bloodborne told you to hunt some beasts on your way to Bergenworth. Dark Souls 3 told you to slay the Lords of Cinder. And Sekiro has someone to tell you what you need to do next at pretty much every point in the story. If asking for a very basic glint of direction makes me a casual, then fine, whatever, I'm a casual, I don't care. But that doesn't negate the fact that Melina is blatantly withholding information that she has every reason to divulge and no reason not to. And speaking of strange omissions, there are a number of mechanics and quality of life improvements that, for one reason or another, didn't make it into Elden Ring. Maybe these were creative decisions, maybe it was because of time and budget, I don't really know, but in fairness to the game, I think some of them are perfectly excusable, though there are a few that don't quite make sense to me. And to be perfectly clear, I don't think the game is necessarily at fault for omitting certain elements of prior games, but I do think it's still worth discussing given just how many elements of these games were carried over into Elden Ring. I can understand omitting certain mechanics like the grappling hook from Sekiro or the rally mechanic from Bloodborne, although the latter does exist as an optional upgrade, which, hey, that's pretty cool. As interesting as I'm sure it would be to see the grappling hook and even ledge shimmying from Sekiro, especially with the increased focus on exploration and platforming, and not to mention the presence of stealth, I understand that these would still be quite difficult to implement on their own, given the final result of Elden Ring's level design. The game just wasn't made with the grappling hook or even ledge shimmying in mind, and it's perfectly fine. I do, however, have to call into question why we've yet to see the return or even the evolution on certain other mechanics. For instance, whatever happened to trick weapons from Bloodborne? This mechanic was universally praised and is still held in a very high regard, and while it is obvious why it wouldn't make sense to apply trick mechanics to a straight sword or a basic heavy axe, would it not have been the most kick-ass thing in the world to see a handful of weapons in Elden Ring with exclusive weapon arts that allowed them to transform into entirely new forms with their own movesets and even transitional attacks? If your answer is no, you're a liar. Another mechanic I would have really appreciated seeing carry over from Sekiro, barring stealth mechanics, would have been the... I don't actually know what you call this. You can see it on the screen though, you know, it's the one where you hold down a button and you turn into an item vacuum. The suck. We'll call it the suck. This was a nice quality of life addition that would still have a place in a game like Elden Ring, which has numerous encounters that have multitudes of enemies. I understand the absence of this is far from a pressing issue, and again I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that Elden Ring sucks because it didn't, well, include the suck, but it still would have been nice to see make a return, and I do think it would have had a place in this game. Similarly, photo mode is far from a critical element to Souls games, having only just been introduced in the Demon Souls remake, but Elden Ring is such a gorgeous game, and not having a photo mode just feels like a war crime. Some visual filters would have also been really cool to see. Personally, and this is a completely subjective nitpick, Elden Ring's color palette feels very heavy on its use of yellow, so I would have personally appreciated a cool blue filter that makes the world feel more like Siofra. Again, far from a pressing issue, but it is strange to see a complete absence of a photo mode in a game as gorgeous as this. Something I would have liked to see in Round Table Hold specifically would have been a practice dummy like the one found in Sekiro. Being able to test out your damage output and even just having an enemy to practice things like parrying against would have been really nice to see. In fact, given just how much this game emphasizes its difficulty, that feels like it was almost a necessary inclusion that they just chose not to implement for unknown reasons. I do, however, have to call into question why it is that armor upgrading has not found its way into Elden Ring, let alone modern Souls games. Let's be honest, the defensive quality of armor in Elden Ring is pretty negligible at best, barring the especially heavy armor like that of Radahn. Elden Ring is Fashion Souls central, and hey, the fashion potential is seriously impressive here, but at the same time, why exactly couldn't we be given a method for upgrading our armor like in Dark Souls? Like, I seriously don't understand why FromSoft just refuses to bring this mechanic back. And speaking of defensive elements, does anyone else remember when poise was, you know, a thing? Like, yeah, Elden Ring has poise, but given just how hard and how fast these enemies tend to hit, it might as well not even exist once you enter the latter sections of the game. Like, I'm not even trying to be cynical here, you can wear the tankiest of gear and still be absolutely ragdolled by some of these late game enemies. Like, Why, Elden Ring? Someone tell me why. Also, this is one I genuinely am pissed off about. Am I the only one who misses chopping off enemy tails to get secret weapons? This was something introduced in the first Dark Souls, and I remember back then thinking that it was the coolest mechanic ever, even though back then the character models moving was kind of awkward, so acquiring these weapons wasn't always the most fun thing. But still, it was so cool that it existed, especially on certain enemies that you wouldn't even think would have it, like Priscilla. Then Dark Souls 2 had instances where enemies could lose limbs, but there was never a tangible reward, they just kind of fell off, which is visually cool, but it does call into question the absence of the reward. And then there was Bloodborne, which had certain enemy limbs acting as a weak point, and I guess Lawrence also lost his legs, but again, there wasn't an actual item to reward the player. I've just really missed this mechanic ever since Dark Souls 1. With every new FromSoft release, I have consistently been trying to see if they bring this mechanic back, and I have been consistently let down every single time. And let's be real, Elden Ring would have honestly been the perfect game to bring this back with, given the abundance of bosses with tails like Morgott, the dragons, and hell, even Godric with all of his limbs. Oh well, I guess. One last omission I wanted to cover was that of Covenants. Now, Covenants have always been a bit finicky when it comes to Souls games. The individual Covenants range from worthless to excellent, and the implementation of Covenants as a mechanic has been something of a mixed bag. Sekiro didn't even bother with Covenants, given they wouldn't have really made any narrative sense, but Bloodborne did manage to feature 3 different Covenants, and while they certainly could have been more fleshed out, it was at least cool to see the system adapted into such a different style of game, even if it wasn't all that great. The absence of Covenants in Elden Ring, though, is honestly strange given just how many characters you can align yourself with to achieve a different ending. I suppose in a way they do kind of exist, at least in a narrative context, but it just feels like there could have been so much more. It feels like Covenants have such a massive degree of untapped potential, but From doesn't really seem too interested in exploring them to that potential, and that's really a shame, because I could easily see a game as massive as this with such immense build variety benefiting from the inclusion of Covenants. Imagine a handful of subcommunities within the Elden Ring community coming together to arrange clan wars and tournaments on certain dates and in certain spots of the map. That kind of thing would be awesome to see. Yeah, there are community events, but the implementation of a Covenant system would go such a long way in bolstering those communities and all of their events. But sadly, I guess it just wasn't meant to be. I want to make it clear one more time that I don't think the lack of these mechanics ruins Elden Ring, okay? I'm not saying the game's bad because it didn't implement shimmying, okay? But given just how many of these mechanics aren't present, and not to mention the potential that they have, their absence does stick out, and I felt like it was worth discussing to some extent. Elden Ring has far greater issues, many of which I've yet to even discuss, but it felt appropriate to stop and consider what could have been in certain regards. The final element of Elden Ring's gameplay I wanted to discuss in this section is none other than the Spirit Ashes. These are a surprisingly controversial inclusion, but I personally found them to be a very worthwhile addition to Elden Ring's gameplay. Not only do Spirit Ashes allow for offline players to engage in summoning, but they also allow for much greater versatility than your typical NPC summons. NPC summons are helpful, for sure, but being able to select from such a wide variety of character and enemy types to have at your beck and call opens the game up to a whole new dimension of player expression. You can headcanon what your summons mean to your player character, you can explore different strategies against specific encounters, you can even retrofit your builds to synchronize with your favorite summon. Seriously, I think Spirit Ashes are a fantastic addition overall. They also help to draw enemy aggro, if only for a brief instance, which can make combat far more tolerable than it is purely solo. Elden Ring's enemies are relentless, and Spirit Ashes are a great way of mitigating the monotonous downtime of repeatedly dodging while enemies dish out their 12-hit Mega Wombo combos. Of course, this has led some to negatively perceive Spirit Ashes as being a sort of easy mode that cheapens the experience. This is really ironic to me considering the absolute plethora of non-Spirit Ash mechanics which can be used to make the game significantly easier. The idea that the experience can be cheapened by taking advantage of a very prominent mechanic for what is obviously its intended use reduces the experience of the game to nothing but one of difficulty, which, as I said in the intro, is is a fallacious argument. By that logic, anyone who isn't a blind, deaf, and mute vegetable playing with an upside-down Guitar Hero controller with inverted controls, 1 point of health, no magic, no weapons, no gear, level 1, and without dodging or blocking is by default cheapening their experience by not making the game as impossibly hard as reality will allow. More to the point, difficulty is not the sole and defining element of any video game, yes, even FromSoft games, because there is far more to a video game than the challenge they present. I agree that challenge matters, and difficulty can play a role in making and breaking any number of video games for any number of players. But the idea that anyone is cheapening their experience by utilizing a mechanic that the developers purposefully implemented is a monumentally stupid suggestion. This kind of logic could easily be turned around right back to the person making this kind of argument, because whatever it is that makes the game's perfect difficulty is completely arbitrary. So what if I used Spirit Ashes? You played the game using a healing flask. Oh yeah? Well, at least I didn't rely on dodging. Oh yeah? Well, at least I didn't use sorcery. Oh yeah? Well, at least I didn't use a strength build. Oh yeah? Seriously, don't bother engaging with people who unironically make these kinds of arguments, because they have the mental capacity of a 5-year-old. You will not change their mind, and their mind is not worth changing, because nothing they have to say actually matters. Play the game however the hell you want. If something you're using is broken, then it's the developer's fault for implementing it in the first place. You're not obligated to handicap yourself to the approval of random elitist douchebags on the internet. Now, with that out of the way, I also want to be clear that I'm not suggesting Spirit Ashes are perfect, as they do possess one major caveat. As useful as Spirit Ashes can be in most situations, the AI for them is unfortunately about as intelligent as your average Twitter user. No, I'm not calling it X. They follow very simple behaviors and attack patterns, but unfortunately their ability to respond to enemy behavior seems to be severely compromised, which is unfortunate given just how aggressive Elden Ring's enemies can be. Spirit Ashes honestly seem downright docile by comparison. And to be perfectly clear, I don't need the Spirit Ashes to outright annihilate bosses or put a hard stop to their strongest attacks, but I would appreciate if my summons could stop running so recklessly into the most obviously telegraphed super attacks. If I had to sum it up, I'd compare the AI of Spirit Ashes to the AI of Demon Souls on PS3, whereas the AI of Elden Ring's enemies is more on par with Bloodborne and Sekiro with just how nonstop and relentless they can be. Elden Ring has some good ideas, and it does a fair amount well with its gameplay, but it's also undeniable that there were some major misfires along the way, and I think that's a shame. I've made the joke that Elden Ring is basically Dark Souls 3 2, given just how derivative it can feel, but at least Dark Souls 3 was pretty damn polished from top to bottom. Again, it had its problems, but damn if it's not a good game. Elden Ring, on the other hand, has an abundance of rather major flaws, ranging from a lack of proper balancing to some utterly baffling technical and design missteps. I find it very difficult not to be disappointed with Elden Ring once I really start to add these things up, and that's such a shame because the game obviously had all the potential in the world to be FromSoft's next masterpiece. Unfortunately, I don't feel that was the case. Oh, before I forget, did you know this game has a crafting system?